I'd like to begin, as I always do, by reminding you that Something to Talk About is sponsored by Fieldstone Communities of Bainbridge Island, which offers memory care and is soon to finish their work on assisted living and independent living up on Rolling Bay. They also offer day stay and respite programs. If you'd like to learn more or take a tour, call 360-689-4314. And as we get ready to chat with Ann Lovejoy once a month, we talk about all the things that are happening. And on this, the first day of summer, we can start to talk about warm weather, which is, promising itself a little bit today anyway. But I'd like to acknowledge that we are gathering on the ancestral homeland of the Suquamish people, the people of the clear salt water, who have been living on these waters of the Salish since time immemorial. We honor them and we are grateful for their hospitality. So with that, I'm going to say hi to Ann.
Hey, Reed. Yeah, happy solstice, right?
Absolutely.
I always love this day. It's like the first day of summer, the longest day, shortest night. And today there are going to be 17.3 hours of daylight and only 6.7 hours of darkness. And I like to think about this day when we get to the winter solstice, when it's flipped and we have like 15 minutes of daylight and 27 hours of darkness. Because boy, this is a day to remember, right? And hang on to. I just wanted to talk a little bit before I start talking about real gardening stuff. I wanted to talk a little about some of the ancient ways of marking the growing year, which interestingly to me, they were fairly similar in temperate areas, though, for millennia, people all over the world celebrated the summer solstice, usually by honoring goddesses of fertility, like Astarte and Ishtar. They're Middle Eastern goddesses of fecundity, love, sexuality, and good fortune. And Dea, who's also a goddess of good fortune and change, kind of like the Native American changing woman, who was also sort of a summer solstice celebratory figure. And then Roman and Greek Vesta and Hestia, goddesses of hearth and home, gardening and farming. A lot of cultures also honored sun gods, which for whatever reason, sun is usually considered to be male, thanking them for warmth and light. There are a number of like First Nations and Native American traditions with tribal sun dances, for instance, celebrating the strength of the sun and the power of light and warmth. But also these were major calendar points for resetting solar clocks and calendars, again, through the temperate world. I love that in some tropical countries, the summer solstice is called the day of no shadow, because at noon in the tropics, the sun is directly overhead. And there's a moment where nothing casts a shadow. And it's always a big kids thing where everybody goes out and stands out and has no shadow, woot, right? It's kind of fun. We can't quite do that here because the sun isn't really directly overhead, but it's close, right? Then, in temperate regions, both in winter and summer solstices are usually celebrated in similar ways with a lot of rowdiness, for one thing. Lots of bonfires and feasts, music and dancing. There's certain summer flowers that have long associations with solstice celebrations, including roses, lavender, chamomile, sunflowers, and people often in different parts of the world to this day still like wear floral garlands and headdresses and making them for farm animals. I remember when I was a student in Italy going to these little villages at different years, and they would have these wonderful festivals where the cows and the horses were decked out in flowers and led through the town on the solstice, which I thought was so charming, right? Also, traditions of gathering herbs and flowers for medicinal use or making garden-based meals. And of course, like feasting on fresh food. There are some traditions that encourage using up any remaining storage crops in a big feast to mark the end of the old food and the beginning of the new food gathering cycle. Because can you imagine how tired people must have been about with potatoes and cabbage and some of those long storing melons and stuff like that? So the feasts weren't always like the fresh new food. They were often like, clean out that storage, like get rid of those wrinkly apples and use up all those shriveled carrots and start again, right? I thought that was kind of fun. And the ashes from those solstice bonfires are often spread on gardens and fields to ensure fertility. And there are other fertility rites, like many a child born in mid-March was the fruit of a very popular personal fertility ritual that was observed pretty much all around the world on solstice, right? That,
That would be hooray, hooray, outdoor intercourse
Well, there
day.
you go.
yeah, right. And to this day in Ballard, for instance, on the summer solstice, there's a big tradition of naked cycling, riding your bicycles with people wearing mostly body paint and tattoos, and riding rather quickly through the town. You have to be hardy some years because it isn't always the best weather. Today, you could probably not freeze your butt off, but there have been solstices where it'd be like, I think I'm going to wear a little fleece with that, right? But yeah, I think it's kind of fun. The big Ballard ceremonies are fun to go to because they do have kind of like street bonfires even, and lots of feasting and music and wild revels, which, we can all use a wild revel now and then, right?
Mhm.
The other thing I was going to talk about that I find really fascinating is gardening by the moon, because for really like millennia, moon signs were the guides for gardening tasks or farming tasks of all kinds of things. And the only person I know who really kind of promotes that is Ed Hume. I was going to show you this. Every year he puts out a little garden almanac, and it goes through and tells you all the stuff to do in different months and different times in every month. So today, for instance, it is the light of the moon, first quarter in Cancer, and it would be a day to fertilize lawns, trees, and shrubs, plant perennials and biennials, divide spring blooming flowers, plant flowering kale so that it will be beautiful in fall. Set out chrysanthemums, cannas, and begonias again, because they're going to be coming on later. Plant spinach and cabbage. Sow more seeds of lettuce and chard. Set out annuals. Plant new lawns and color spots. Take cuttings and graft. That's an interesting thing because grafting and cuttings really can be very much affected by the time of year that you do them. Traditionally, I usually do cuttings and grafting like in March and September, October, but sometimes into November too on a milder year, and they take really well. But the things that will do well right now at this time of year is stuff like lavender and rosemary and some of those herbs. If you pinch off the growing tips, or things like catmints, not the blooming stems, but the unbloomed stems, pinch off a couple inches and stick them in the soil, and a lot of them will root right in and give you new flowers, new plants. I mean, so that's a really good thing to do with like late blooming perennials like asters. You can divide them now, or you can take like pinch cuttings of those and stick them in the ground, and they often will really take off and root really nicely at this time of year. So the other thing that you just about get ready to start doing now is pinching back early blooming perennials. Like if you have in our gardens at the senior center, you'll see there's a lot of catmint, the beautiful blue flowered perennials that bloom and bloom and bloom, and they're huge pollinator favorites. We had a bunch of middle school kids today, and I was challenging them to go look at that garden and identify as many kinds of bees as they could. You can tell different kinds of bees by their coloring and their size. And a lot of them look kind of similar, but their butt markings are different. They'll have like a black spot or a white stripe on their butts. And that's one real way to distinguish, because otherwise they're just little fuzzies, right? But I thought it was kind of fun that they actually got into it, and we're finding quite a few different kinds of pollinators buzzing away out there.
So you were saying that if I were trying to snip back a catmint, I would look for what?
Yeah, so if you look at the catmint, they have these long arms and they're covered with bloom, right? And they're just still going strong. But if you look at the heart of them, and they start to splay out, as they get mature. And if you look at the base, you'll see that new fresh shoots are coming up from that base. And right now they're maybe 4 to 6 inches tall. If you snip a couple inches off a thumb-sized piece of a few of those and stick them in a pot, and I usually put them in the pot, not in the ground, because it's lighter soil, and they don't in the ground around here. The heavy clay can be kind of not as hospitable. So I'll stick them in a pot with some potting soil, and a lot of them will root. Same with lavender foliage, not a flowered shoot, but an unflowered shoot. Same with rosemary. This is a good time to do rosemary starts. Or like I was saying, a lot of the fall bloomers like asters, and even things like phlox and stuff. If you take those unflowered shoots and just take a few inches off, and you can start new little plants.
Wow.
Yeah, real easy.
Should I be should I be taking off obviously with calendula, I'm always pulling them back to try to encourage more blooms. Does that work for some of these things we're talking about now or no?
Yes, and so with catmint particularly, that's a really good example because as I say, it's already refreshing from the base. And one of the things I've done with those very successfully over the years is when they start to die back so that they're browning off those long, beautiful stems, I'll take the sort of middle third of them and cut them all the way back to the ground. And then in another few weeks, the second tier is kind of fading and you cut those all the way back. And a few weeks later, you cut the outermost ones all the way back. And then you'll have this sequence of new shoots that will carry on sometimes even into October, November. So yeah, and you can do that same thing with things like phlox or some of the asters and stuff that are starting to come up very heavily now. If you like trim back about half of them a third of the way, and again, you can use those tips, then they will bloom later and you'll have some of them blooming now. And then as they go off, you trim them back and the ones that you pinched will then be blooming in sequence like that.
I know I have a lot of pollinators that are loving the borage plants I have.
Yeah.
Similar with them?
Borage, you don't really have to do much of anything to borage. It's fairly short-lived no matter what you do, really. And it's going to bloom out by July, August. It's kind of done. It's a short-lived, it's related to basil, and it's in that family. It's kind of a quick bloom, quick death. But because it's so loved by pollinators, you usually can find it sowing itself all over the place, and you'll get volunteer starts of that really easily. And you don't have to do much with that. Sometimes if you have a bush that, I mean, a little, plant that's blooming very heavily, you can, as the top starts to go, you could cut it back and it will send out side shoots and be a little productive a little bit longer. But it's sort of a late spring, very early summer bloomer. But with the calendulas, cycling back to that you talked about, one of the things that if you look at calendulas, you'll see that when they bloom and the petals start to shrivel, they've already set seed. Like as soon as they're pollinated, they begin to set seed. So they're producing, but those seed, they won't be viable unless they're allowed to dry up on the plant. But I don't let them do that until much later in the year. And if you cut back, they're usually on a fairly long stem. So if you cut back deeper into the plant, they'll send up new shoots and keep blooming and blooming and blooming. So just keep taking off the bloomed out blossoms, right? And then you'll get much more production out of them.
And then at the end of the year, if you want to have some seeds, because they certainly want to spread.
Yeah. And one of the great ways to do that is exactly that. Like let them set seed late in the year, like by August, September, they'll keep blooming a lot of times well into the winter. In fact, the reason they're called calendulas, it's calendar flower, because they bloom in Europe where they're native, they bloom a little bit, at least every month of the year, or unless it's super snowy.
Oh,
Anita.
I just wanted to ask, is borage the one, it has blue flowers? Is
Yeah,
that, and
it's
but
kind of
if you put them in lemonade, they turn pink?
Well, any acidy thing, yeah. And there traditionally you put borage blossoms in new wine to make the Mayflowers, and they taste a little bit cucumbery. So you can put them in salads and stuff too.
Okay.
Like all the herbs have edible blossoms.
We always put, I think it was sweet woodruff into the May wine.
Yeah.
And that, yeah. And it actually, I tried it and it did change the flavor. It was really fun.
Yeah.
Besides being pretty. Yeah.
It's pretty. You can do it with like a lemonade as well for kids, or, a sparkling water if you wanted to make like one thing my kids like to do is make like a mint, simple syrup with mint, like macerated mint leaves. They like macerating mint leaves because that's good. And then making that minty syrup. And
I
then
just met some 8th grade boys who might enjoy macerating some leaves.
Oh, you're right. We missed a golden opportunity to talk about macerating. God, you are right. God. But you take a little of that and put it with like a seltzer buzzy, bubble water. And then you can put little flowers in it. Johnny jump ups are good ones to put in, stuff like that. Rosemary blossoms, lavender flowers, of course. all those. And they, it's fun to like harvest the flowers. It's always hard for people to harvest lavender because you harvest it at the peak of bloom or almost before, when they're still slightly in the bud but just beginning to open. That's when they have the most essential oils. And of course, nobody wants to pick them then because that's when they're prettiest, right? But really, if you're saving them for something like you're going to make lavender sachet or lavender shortbread or something like that, you kind of want to pick them in the just as the bud begins to open. That's their strength point.
When it's just beginning at the bottom, you're saying?
Yeah.
Just open.
How the buds are tight and then they start to open up. And
Yeah.
And once they
Just
get
when you're
open,
saying, oh my gosh, this is going to be beautiful.
yeah,
and they only, if you cut the first bloom, they don't send up other blooms, right?
no, that's pretty much it for lavenders.
Yeah, that's what I was afraid of.
But you don't have to cut all of them. So if you have a lot of plants, you can cut a few stems off each, and that way you'll have some to use and some to just enjoy and some to share with the bees, right?
Mhm.
One thing that that's fun about calendulas too is like at this time of year, I go out really every single day and I start pulling the spent blossoms before they really dry up, and I dry them off on a cookie sheet, and then save them. And when I get about a quart, you take organic coconut oil and put it in a crock pot, and then it's about the same amount, a quart of oil and a quart of petals, or even a little more, and have them on very low heat for about 6 hours, and it turns golden. And then strain it, to get all the glunk out, right? And then you put it in the fridge in little jars and stuff, and it's fantastic for skincare. And my granddaughter had chafed, really blistered wrists this winter because she was always playing outside in the snow, and that cleared it up in like 2 days, right? It's really powerful. Like little herby things. The other thing that's really good to do right now, as herbs are sort of coming into their power, is take snippets of things like oregano and thyme, especially. I like thyme, oregano, chives, garlic, and then pulverize it with some. I use the diamond salt, which is mined salt, so it doesn't have any plastic in it. Because unfortunately, sea salt is now almost all of sea salt has little plastic bits in it, which is really too bad. But anyway,
Oh my God.
it's another horrible thing, right? So you take this and you grind it up in your quiz and then spread it in a single layer and bake it off at like 225 until it gets crusty, which is usually about 15, 20 minutes tops. And if you hit it with a spatula, it will go clunk and break into pieces. So, I mean, it's crusty. And then you break that all up and then you put it back in the quiz and then buzz it all up. And now it's stable, shelf stable. And it smells incredible. And I put, TNC has those little jars with the shaky things and covers. And if they have a cover, they'll hold that fragrance and the flavor for months. So they make great Christmas presents or holiday gifts or whatever.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's really fun because one of the favorite ones around here is rosemary and garlic. Rosemary, garlic, and lemon peel. You have to use organic lemons because otherwise there's all that pesticide in the peel. But that's a really nice combination. Or you can do kind of an herbs de Provence combination of lavender, like a little chervil, rosemary, sage, and there's different combinations that are considered traditional, but really they're not that traditional because most of this tradition started like in the 40s after World War II. But if you make those combinations, they taste amazing. And you can make really simple things like steamed vegetables taste fantastic with just a little sprinkle, right?
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or when we make pizzas, I'm a different one with like just basil and salt all ground up, or sometimes basil and garlic and salt, and do that, bake it off, grind it up. And then you put that on top of like a little hand pizza if you're making them. Oh, it's so good. Or like if you're doing eggs, just put it in the pan with the oil and it gets super fragrant and nice. And then you could do scrambled eggs.
Nice.
Yeah. Just little garden gifts, right?
Now, when you say garlic, do you take the green, or do you use the actual bulb of the garlic?
I use the actual garlic bulbs, but that's the greens right now. Like a lot of times they're shooting up and they want to do a blossom thing. So you cut them before the blossom opens. It can be in the pod, but before the blossom opens, you can cut them and grill them. Or some people make garlic pesto out of them. Like that is yummy too.
I do that with the leeks.
Mm.
My leeks are about to bloom.
Yeah, and you don't want them to bloom because that's going to draw energy away from the bulb, and the bulb will start to decay because it's given its goodness to the flower, right? So if you get it when it's in the bulb, in the bud, but not opened yet, then you can have some culinary fun with that. And chives, same thing, chopped chives. Ooh, so good.
Yes, delicious. Also, of course, all these, when if you do lose them, you then have the beauty of the flowering, because that's pretty amazing.
It is. And another pollinator plant, like pollinators
Yeah.
love all those alliums because they look like little spaceships. You know, they each have 1,000 flowers on them. When last year at the garden at the library, I was cutting back this big overgrown dogwood that was just gone crazy. It was in the sidewalk and I was whacking it all the way back. And I kind of cut it pretty hard. And I thought, yeah, that might not come back. But it was amazing. That spring, we looked at and under, it was coming back, but underneath there were literally several hundred of the big allium, those Christophis, because one year I kind of was using those as Christmas decorations, holiday decorations, and I would put the dried flowered heads all in, hanging them in bare branches, and they just looked so great. Well, I must have put a bunch of them in there because they all fell down, and then the bush got so big nobody could see what was going on. It takes several years for them to get blooming size, so they were under there spreading in this big colony. Now there's like this
Wow.
magic carpet of giant blooming big purple Christophii alliums. How cool
Wow.
is that? And that again points out what a benefit benign neglect is to a garden. When you aren't so tidy and let stuff happen, there's room for magic, right?
Well, I have a potato that came out of my compost that's growing. So I made, compost and I put it on my garden, my veggies. And then this plant came up and I'm thinking, that looks like a potato. Well, it's definitely a potato. So my compost gave me potatoes,
Mhm.
or will, and it's
Well.
thriving like crazy.
The first
So I
year,
don't know if it'll be a yellow or a red or
yeah, you'll have to find out. But once you have potatoes, you always have potatoes because the little ones kind of get away.
okay.
You think you dug them all, but you never do. When we
Yeah.
put in that first pollinator garden 2 years ago, and we had compost from the city, and we got a whole bunch of volunteer summer squash, zucchini, and that
Oh,
was hilarious. And so we were picking them, giving them away to people, and people were harvesting, and they were all just in the compost, right?
that's so funny.
Yeah. And often there'll be tomatoes and things. And sometimes when you can tell your septic system isn't really working quite the way it should, because there'll be a little swath of things like melons and tomatoes and so forth that that are in a very fertile area of your lawn, right?
Oh my God.
I know, right? Everyone's always like, am I supposed to eat that or not? But I think once they grow
So
up.
I have a couple questions. First of all, I tested my soil pH and I expected it to be acidic and it's 7.5. And that seems too basic for most of my veggies.
Yeah, most veggies like it on the neutral side. And so compost is
So
almost
that
always
works.
neutral.
I'm sorry?
Compost is almost always neutral and it's a really good buffer. So if you mulch with compost, spring and fall, you should get it to be right about right. Is it near a cement wall or anything like that by any chance?
Well, good point. It's actually a raised bed behind a block wall with a block wall behind it. So
Yeah.
it's like wedged in to the hill.
Okay, and so the leachate from some of the blocks is probably making that basic soil. And again, compost will really help. That's one of the issues. Like when we make raised beds, you got to really think about the materials you're using because it can really affect, what happens to the plants in the beds.
Well, it's beautiful. It's set up perfectly well, but unfortunately, nothing I could have realized
Well,
what I had to put
and
in.
compost is going to help. And if you just keep putting down compost in the
Okay.
spring and in the fall, that should straighten it out before too long. Because as also that leachate,
Yeah.
loses strength over time, and after a while, it's going to kind of neutralize itself, right? Sometimes that
Right.
happens when people build against the side of a house. They have a raised bed there, and they're getting all that concrete leachate, and it's like, there was a big fad for using recycled plastic lumber. Do you remember? Those timbers, what was it called? Holywood or something like that. And that will leach plastics into the soil, and that persists for a long time, especially in rainy climates. Hello. So, and it can go, they said, it's not that big a deal. It only goes 12 to 18 inches well, if you have a small bed, 12 to 18 inches in all directions leaves you a planting strip of about 4 by 4 inches.
Right.
You know,
Like- Yep. And there's the bottom end and the lower wall actually was put in probably 5 years ago. And then the upper wall, because I had this bank and my veggie garden was on an angle and I had to flatten it, and I put a retaining wall behind it. And so that one's only like 2 years old.
yeah, that's
So
probably
the upper
where,
wall is, yeah.
yeah, so it's probably aged out, and time will help. And of course, every time you water, that sort of helps too.
Right.
Watering, I wanted to talk a little about, because people are sort of saying, why do you keep talking about watering? It's raining. And I'm like, well, kind of. But if you actually have been planting recently, you'll discover that a couple inches down, or even an inch down, it's actually really quite dry. That is shocking in a way, because you think, yeah, it's gray, it's cold, it's
Mhm.
chilly, but it isn't really wet down there. And because we had a very dry winter and a very dry spring, and because we're still in a state of drought, with this the 4th year that's been a state of drought. We're no longer in extreme drought, but it doesn't have to be that extreme to affect the plants. And you can tell just walking, driving around the island, you'll see a lot of native plants really struggling because of that dryness. And so remembering that our gardens really aren't wet all the way down, and we have to, especially if you put new stuff in, be really, really sure that you're getting water all the way down to where you want the roots to be, right? A lot of people who water by hand, it's boring, really, right? So it's hard to make yourself stick with it long enough to do a really good job. So it's kind of like when we were in the pandemic, we're all teaching ourselves to go, twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what I'm doing. How long does this have to take before my attention breaks, right? Or whatever. But if we do something like that, pick a little song and sing it while you're standing there. Remember, like a new rose bush needs about 5 gallons a week of water to survive. A new planted little tree, a good sized shrub, all those things need more than just sprinkle, sprinkle. So reminding yourself that you have to, if you're going to water by hand, it's a commitment. It's a good commitment in some ways because it puts the water right where you need it, which is on the soil in the root zone and not all over the whole plant. Because around here, those marine layer mornings can mean it's a perfect opportunity for mildew, and powdery mildew especially, because powdery mildew comes from dry roots and wet leaves. Perfect recipe, right? If you do have that, one of the good things you can do is spray a powdered milk. It's powdered skim milk. You don't need the fat. 10% solution of powdered skim milk, and you can spray it on leaves, especially things like squash. You know how they get just that horrible mildew really, really quick. If you spray the milk on it, they need calcium for one thing, and it really helps fill in some of those. Every leaf has different little stoma, little openings for different kinds of things. And if you fill them up with good stuff like compost tea or skim milk, there won't be as many opportunities for other kinds of things to get in there.
Wow.
I
I
know.
have some more questions.
Yeah.
So I have tomato plants that are blooming like crazy. And wonder if, there's like one sort of stalk and then there's like all these blossoms and even some tomatoes that are forming. Should I take some of the blossoms off?
No, because a lot of them are cluster. Like a lot of the newer tomatoes are cluster tomatoes. They're called grape tomatoes or cherry tomatoes, and you'll get a whole lot of smallish ones on a whole droop of them, right? So no, they're great. And if they're not getting what they need, and they'll shed them themselves, you'll see them drop. But usually,
Which is my next question.
oh, why are they doing that?
That a couple of the tomato plants. I have 5 tomato plants, And a couple of them, I thought, oh, something's eating the blossoms, right? But then I looked at the plants, nothing is, there's no squirrel or possum or raccoon that's messed with these plants because the leaves are fine. Nothing wrong with the plants. But blossoms have fallen off and I looked around. Yes, they are. There they are right on the ground.
Sometimes
And
that's
that once
birds.
the blossom forms, birds.
Yeah, sometimes birds peck at
The
it.
blossoms are on the ground.
Yeah, so they'll peck at it.
Oh, well,
fall off. But also when the fruit starts to develop, the blossom will fall off. So you might see a teeny tiny baby tomato left behind.
oh no. The little stem that the blossom's on, once the blossom seems to mature, it seems to get this elbow. Like the stem is green, bright green, dark green, and then there's this little ring of a lighter green, and it goes from being like this to like this.
Oh,
So here's the blossom,
okay.
and all of them seem to be doing that.
That sounds
and
like a calcium deficiency. So you
It's
might
a
want to,
normal part of its development to me.
well, we might
Oh,
want to
okay,
do the milk thing, the spray it with some of that powder milk.
okay.
Because sometimes many of our native soils tend to be pretty low in calcium around here, which is why we don't have native land snails. All the snails that you see on the ground are imported from California, not usually on purpose, or other places. They come in on nursery plants and stuff like that. But we don't in this part of Pacific Northwest, there's not any native land snails. There's slugs, but they don't have shells because there's not enough calcium in the soils to support that, right? Anyway, the point is a lot of the plants that need calcium, and tomatoes are among them, they'll start to get the weak stems that break really easily. And you might notice it when the fruit sets and then they break off before they really get ripe. That's a nutritional deficiency too. So if you're fertilizing, you might want to look for a number that's not real high. Like sometimes they're giving,
Yeah, I got one 453 or something.
that should be
It's really
fine.
low.
Yeah, that should be fine. But try
Okay.
the coffee grounds too, because that helps give them a little direct nitrogen without bumping everything else out of line.
And what about what you were talking, calcium, the milk,
Yeah,
and nitrogen from the fertilizers?
yeah.
Okay.
It's actually pretty amazing. That old milk trick, the pioneers used to, when they were growing their pumpkins and stuff, one of the things the kids used to do is like, you take a little saucer of milk, and when they were growing for 4-H, right, they wanted to have the biggest, coolest pumpkins, or we needed to have really good rinds on those pumpkins. You take a saucer of milk, and then the stem that's going to the pumpkin that's starting to form, or the big melon or whatever, and you make a little tiny slice in it. You don't cut it through, of course, but just make a tiny slice, put it in the saucer of milk with a rock on top, and it will actually suck up the milk, and it goes down the stem and it becomes integrated into the skin, and they get tougher skin. I love that. Isn't that kind of
Wow.
fun? Right?
One more question. Basil. I think I've been too soon, in the ground too soon. The plants.
Yeah.
And the leaves are, it's growing, and the brand new leaves in the tops, they're all bright, glossy green, but the older leaves are kind of limp and getting brown spots on them and then kind of falling off. And I don't see bugs. And I don't see what looks like fungus. I think they just got a combination of too cold and then maybe hot, because we did have a hot spell too.
It's
I don't
mostly
know.
the cold and the wet, because that's a plant that doesn't really like either one of those things. And now the temperatures at night are just starting to bump into the 50s. So we're getting into, but it's still like 51, 52, and it has been 48, 49,
I
47.
saw that, yeah.
Yeah. And so those cold nights really set them back. A lot, and when it plants like tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, basil, things that are really tropical, beans, stuff like that. They don't grow well in cold temperatures, but it should be helpful now. But I usually grow things like that in big containers rather than actually in the ground. I mean, big, like a tree pot, give them plenty of scope, or a container that can hold at least a cubic foot of potting soil, right? That size is good for like,
Okay.
And for tomatoes, I would do
You
2
bet.
feet, right? Or because they
Well, my
need,
basil is all in the ground, but yeah,
well,
but I could transplant.
yeah, if they're not
My
happy,
peppers are doing fine. The tomatoes, I think that's the problem, the nutrition, because they're growing and there's no bad leaves or anything like that. But
they're
I do have an
gross,
eggplant that,
that has funky leaves.
pardon me,
Well, so the tomatoes
the
are
basil
heavy
has
feeders.
the
So you want to
ones where
fertilize
the
those tomatoes
blossoms are
like every
falling
2
off and they
weeks.
bending. Yeah,
Does that make
Yeah.
sense? Yeah.
I'll do that.
Because when you water, of
I'll keep
course,
doing that and maybe give them some of that.
I use the Dr. Earth stuff. I really like that.
Yeah.
There's some powdery, I mean, there's like granular stuff that you just kind of put down, and every time you water, it washes in a little bit more. But because every time you water, of course, those nutrients get washed away too, eventually. So feeding every couple weeks for the annuals that really need a little help when it's not perfect weather for them,
Okay.
that will help them get a better start.
Okay.
The interesting thing about tomatoes is like they don't like it to be too cold, like under 55 is not their happy place. But they also, when it gets about 80, sometimes they'll start dropping blossoms. They'll abort blossoms at that temperature too. Which
Yeah.
when you think about, they're tropical plants, that seems kind of interesting. But that's just sort of their native range, right?
But
I just realized
we
I'm a
don't have that we don't have that much humidity when it's really hot. We're in the tropic. When it's hot, it's also humid. So that might be part of it too with the tomatoes.
Well, they
I'm
get
guessing. I don't know.
blight really, that's very frequent here, late blight, early blight, whatever. And that's why I do like mulching with the coffee grounds, because that's um, a really good sort of barrier defense against the blight for whatever reason, which is kind of cool, right? And I don't drink coffee, but everybody else does. So
Well,
you can always get some.
yeah, I grind my. Oh, I've got plenty of that. That's great to hear.
Yeah.
Is
They're
it good? Else? Potatoes? Is it good?
not for potatoes so much, but good for roses and clematis.
Oh,
Yeah, those plants really like the boost,
oh,
and the
good.
tomatoes too. But yeah, if some
Might
things
help with the pH.
with peppers, you don't really want to fertilize them too high, because then that dilutes the
Okay.
potency of their pepperiness. Right. And that's why
Oh,
like you don't
okay.
fertilize things like lavender either. The hardy herbs, they don't need to be fertilized. The little compost is great. That helps them be more fragrant too. It kind of builds the essential oils, but you don't want to pump the hardy herbs with too much fertilizer, because that, again, it dilutes the potency of their fragrance. And if there's a flavored element to it, that is diluted as well.
So is it okay to put just a little compost all season long in there, and the herbs and the?
Yeah, that's what they like, because then you're feeding the soil and letting the soil do the work of feeding the plant.
Laura, did you have something you wanted to add? I saw you had taken your mute off for a second.
No, I just joked that I realized that I'm a tomato, because that's my happy place too.
There you go, right? We
Yeah.
have a narrow range.
Yeah, pretty much. But I guess I do have a question. We planted a bunch of Walla Walla onions, and we've been harvesting some, but we planted a lot of them. You only, and so we're gonna share some. But can I leave them in the ground, or should I be thinking about getting them out of there pretty soon?
The thing is, as they size up, summer onions are not keepers.
Okay.
So they don't really, they just start to kind of lose quality.
Okay.
But yeah, I'm sure, like, bring some to the senior center. People be
Yep.
thrilled to have them, right? Share
Yep.
them around with your neighbors.
Yep.
Um,
Okay.
Yeah, I lived in Walla Walla for quite a while, and it was like they're delicious, but they don't last.
right.
Okay.
And they're born to be summer grill ingredients,
fun.
right? Yeah.
Okay.
big-
No,
big
this is
fat
good.
rings grilled on. Oh, they're delicious, right?
No, it sounds good. I mean, I was so excited. I've never grown onions before, and one of the neighbors at the garden had, an inordinate number of them and just handed me a fistful. So I planted them all, and it's just been so fun. They're
Yeah,
just
the
beautiful.
bundles are
Miss them.
usually.
Yep.
The bundles are usually like 100,
Okay.
and most of us don't actually have space for 100. But if you want to do keeper onions, you can do those, and then you can harvest those over the winter. They can stay in the ground, like leeks can stay in the ground over the winter too. But they'll start losing quality in the spring as things heat up. And that's when you'll see they want to bloom, right?
Mhm.
And that's when the bulb starts to deteriorate.
Okay. Good to know.
I was going to say a little teeny bit about summer pruning of fruit trees, because that I got asked a bunch of questions about that recently. But one of the things that what happens with a lot of fruit trees is if they get injured at all when people do weed whacking or whatever, they'll sucker like crazy. And those suckers, if you cut them off, just make more suckers. But the one magic time when you can cut all the suckers back and water shoots without creating another flush of suckers is like July, and the window July into early August. So if you're having fruit trees that have a lot of suckers at the base, or water shoots are like, if there's the branch, the ones that go straight up off the branch, those are they're not going to be productive, and they are actually detrimental to the health of the tree. So if you take those off flush right to the base, and then also there's something called a hanger. So the branch would be out and the hangers would come down from the bottom of the branch, not off the sides, right? So if you take the suckers off and then it goes up, you take the hangers off and it goes up. And that's where it's supposed to be, right? But the suckers and the hangers kind of weigh the branches down. So if they're too close to the ground, that's a really good way to get some lift out of them. Oh, I know. Some of the other things somebody was saying, they thought they were having a really heavy crop of apples this year, which I was a little surprised because it was so cold in the spring that a lot of places there weren't enough bees, and they were pretty clear there wasn't going to be great pollination. But if that does happen, you might want to prop those branches early to make sure they have support, because heavy laden fruit can actually crack an older tree pretty easily. But I think on the whole, it might be more common to see fruit. This may not be the best fruit year ever, because again, that cold spring meant it was windy too. And so rain and wind shatter those blossoms before the bees had a chance to do anything about them. And we did not see a lot of bees early this year. I was really surprised that it was really late May before I started seeing a lot of bees. And now there's a ton, but that means, in my neighborhood, there's not going to be a lot of plums this year, for instance.
Second year in a row.
Yeah, it's
climate change. And I guess in part,
I think
things are going to be different.
Yeah, and we're also that, El Nino, La Nina cycle kind of messes stuff up periodically too. I always love looking at the NOAA websites, and they're always like, yeah, you have a 50% chance of being hotter than usual.
Okay, thank you.
Right. So they were saying that June was going to be hot and dry. So that didn't happen. It's been really quite cool and fairly wet for June, right? A lot of jokes about January. No idea what's going to happen for the rest of the summer. Again, they're still calling for hot, dry, like 70s and 80s all through July and August, and not much rain until October. But, I think it's a crapshoot personally. I don't think anybody knows what's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, they're good on the week, but on the month or the season, a little harder.
Well, yeah. And, stuff happens. One thing it does look like, it's so interesting to me that this year, because of this rain that we've been having, the wildfire warnings have gone down quite a bit, which is great, right? But I thought it was kind of interesting that the East Coast is getting hammered with that smoke. Um, One thing I learned last year when I was researching it is that the smoke residue on foliage actually can be, in the long term, helpful to plants because it carries a fair amount of nutrients with it, just like ash does, right? So, I mean, it's horrible and it looks nasty. And I was hosing it off, but apparently it actually has some qualities of that can be beneficial. Like after Mount St. Helens blew up, there was fantastic grape harvests for years, several years, because the ash carried all these nutrients, right? So I guess it's a silver lining thing, right?
Right. We have to work on our gratitude and point it in the right direction.
Yeah, and modify our expectations. One thing I will say is like, I don't even try to grow big tomatoes around here anymore. I just grow the cherry types, the little ones, because they definitely do well. I have to say, my favorite kind for the last few years is called Midnight Snack. And it's one of those dark, almost black cherry tomatoes. And when you pull the stem off, there's a perfect red star where the full stem was. And they are so delicious. That sweet tart balance is just incredible. And that one has been really, really reliable for me. And they're hand bred, there's no GMO mischief going on there. But what I thought was fascinating is that the breeders in Oregon who developed it had gone to the Galapagos Islands and were looking at native tomato species that grow there that have naturally a lot of anthocyanins that makes the blue fruit in blueberries. And they're, really good for you too. But it also gives the foliage a dusky, dark quality that is a natural sunscreen. And they chose the species where the coloration migrates also into the fruit. Yeah, look at that. And these are interesting. When they're ripe, they will go kind of matte instead of being glossy. And if you try to pick them when they're glossy black, they just taste like marbles. They're not nice. But as soon as they really ripen, they get a little bit duller. The coat becomes sort of matte, and then they are just perfect. Yeah, that's the one. They are so good. And of course, Sun Gold. That's one of the best of the little yellows, right? Those are so
Can we go
productive.
back to that tomato picture again?
Well,
Sorry.
yeah, no, that's okay. We'll just there's a small fee for the sharing.
Thank you. So, Anne, you see that blossom
Yeah,
over the right-hand side?
yeah,
And you see that little elbow?
yeah.
That's what I'm talking about. And it's breaking off there, the blossom.
Yeah, so
That
that
seems
is
normal.
that's a nutritional issue. So
Okay.
I would say, another thing to think about is kelp, liquid kelp,
Oh, okay.
because that really strengthens cell walls and gives the foliage and stems much more strength. So try giving it some
Okay.
diluted liquid kelp every other week.
I can do that.
Yeah. Kelp is, it's the fastest growing plant on the planet, right? And
Is
it
it?
has a lot of nutrients in it that all kinds of plants can use. So,
Yeah.
and the other
Good
thing
for
that reminds me of is that as your tomato plants start forming fruit, if you go down, I don't go to Eagle Harbor because it's kind of dirty, but I go out to Fay Bainbridge and get like a gallon of seawater and then give every plant like a quart of seawater one time when they're just starting to build fruit. And then it really sparks the flavor.
I am stunned by that. I have never heard of anything like that. I mean, in Maine, we used to collect the seaweed, and that was a bladderwort. It was with
Uh-huh.
it wasn't kelp. But anyway, we would collect that and put it in our gardens. And that was what we did, how we fertilized in the spring and fall.
Yeah, they're asking us not to collect
But
seed
I've
because
never done it. I've never.
So Anne, you were going to say
'Cause of-
something about not collecting seaweed, right?
Yeah, and there's because so many natural ecological systems are challenged right now. They're saying like, don't take stuff away from the beach. So I don't do that, but I do use there are areas where the kelp beds are harvested on a regular basis and have been for years and are kind of nurtured, and that kelp meal or liquid kelp is really full of minerals and stuff. And it's just something that really helps plants get like strengthen the cell walls so that their foliage is stronger and their stems are stronger. So that's just a great way to go with that. And the saltwater thing came about from Cornell University studies when, New Jersey was one of the famous places for growing tomatoes for 100 years or more. And then they started losing their savor. And part of it is because they're doing the same crop over year after year after year and not replenishing the soil. But part of it they discovered was because the minerals had been leached out by the irrigation systems they were using. So they started that you can actually buy like 1,000-pound sea salt extracts for farmers that go in their irrigation systems and deliver this one-time boost. But for us, you don't need to do that. You can just go down and get yourself a gallon of, I've gone down and seen like kayakers out there and I'll ask them to paddle out a little bit and get me a cleaner gallon than what is sloshing up on the shore. But yeah, it's kind of neat that it's really a sort of not intuitively obvious because we know that salt can really harm plants, right? Like back in New England, when they salt the roads and then all the verges die off because the salt is so deadly. And even back in the Greek times, that one of the things they would do to overthrow their enemies was salt the fields, right? Sow the fields with salt and kill off everything, bastards. But anyway, sea salt in moderation is not going to do that. So that's kind of cool.
And you've made me think of both grandparents on each side of my family in this conversation, because my grandparents on my dad's side lived in New Jersey, and every year they'd bring us a big cooler full of tomatoes, and I still have never had as good a tomato as those. They were just so good. And then earlier when you were talking about Italy and the dressing up the animals, I had an image, and I don't know if this ever happened, but I had an image of my yaya, my grandmother in Greece, dressing up her donkey, because it just seemed like a thing she would have done.
Mhm.
But anyway, so thank you.
Yeah, she probably did do that because
Yeah,
it was
she
so
did.
charming.
It was Yanni.
Yeah,
that was her donkey.
like swags around their necks. And some of them had little straw hats with holes cut for their ears. And I'm not even kidding. It was so corny and cute.
Oh, I bet.
And then flowers on the straw hats. I mean, come on. It was
Yeah,
adorable.
that's beautiful.
Yeah. And a lot of times the children and the old women were the ones leading the animals,
Mhm.
which I thought was pretty sweet too. Yeah.
Well, we have sown another hour of wonderful gardening talk. And I'm sure it's going to bear great fruit. Thank you, Anne.
You're welcome. Yeah. So next time, let me know how your tomatoes are doing.
Okay, well, we'll see you next month. We're going to see you sooner than that, though, because we're going to talk about words that hurt and words that heal.
We are as a panel. And if any of you would like to show up and pitch in on that, I think it's really an important topic, like thinking about our vocabulary, even something I said earlier today, where I said a situation was going south. And then I was kind of remembering vaguely that I think that that's actually kind of a cultural racist slur in itself, right? You think, wow, so many phrases that we say without thinking turn out to have pretty ugly roots. So, but some others are beautiful, and we can substitute the words of peace for the words of trauma, right?
And yes, and metaphors can be made every day.
When is
If you-
this read?
And it's if you want to see what's coming up on our programs, you can go to biseniorcenter.org/calendar, or on our website, just click on the What's Up item, and you will see that words that hurt and words that heal are coming. It's coming up next Monday, the 26th.
Okay.
But there are other things that are coming up too.